Namaskar and welcome to yet another edition of Insight. I am Charu Karthike. Today we shift focus to North Korea. North Korea has declared that it has conducted its third nuclear test. Its previous two nuclear tests were conducted in 2006 and in 2009. A lot of concern has been expressed by almost the entire international fraternity as far as North India's nuclear test is concerned, because they said that this is in contravention, in clear violation of the United Nations regulations as far as nuclear non-proliferation is concerned. In this edition of Insight, I'll be trying to find out from various experts in my studio here as to what does North Korea's third nuclear test mean for the international nuclear non-proliferation regime, and what does it do to the international nuclear geopolitics. So all of that and much more in this edition of Insight. Joining me in Insight today is a distinguished panel of experts. On my extreme left is Dr. Sreeram Chaulia, Dean, Jindal School of International Studies. Mr. Chaulia, thank you so much for coming here. Dr. Chaulia, apart from North Korea's intended message that it is not ready to buckle down under US-led international pressure, what does this mean for global nuclear geopolitics?
Well, clearly an Asia with multiple nuclear weapons powers is obviously going to be grist for more conflict and greater tension. There is, of course, the theory of nuclear peace, as in if more countries have nuclear weapons, they will not fight with each other. But as we know, the South Korea, which is directly affected by this, is covered by a US nuclear umbrella. So the North, in many ways, claims that all these actions are defensive. And in many ways, it is to protect the regime, which is number one concern for them always. The regime's security and the regime's priorities have often overridden those of the society. And secondly, they say it's for national security and for balancing out the threat that they foresee, because the United States has over 25,000 troops in South Korea, has over nearly 40,000 troops in Japan. And the North always feels that, it is being surrounded on all sides, and there's a definite threat to the regime, because there's all these models being drawn up about what will happen after the Kim dynasty collapses. So regime security, national security, regional security, they see it as a positive step, as a way of assertion and as a way of warning others not to take them lightly. And the other thing is, for the world at large, I would say North Korea has a reputation of being a very unpredictable player, as a kind of a maverick. The current Kim's father, who had passed away, was being portrayed and lampooned around the world as some kind of a diabolic monster who at the same time has all these pop interests and has got wacky hairstyle, and who is this person? So part of this thing, the inscrutability of North Korea, makes it more worrisome, because they are not easy to read and to understand the intentions, unlike the South, which is a pretty transparent and democratic society. So that's one of the major issues. And the other thing, as Ambassador mentioned, the defensive capabilities of the other powers in the neighborhood, especially the anti-ballistic missile defense systems, they are now going to be strengthened. And I'm not sure that's necessarily positive, because that increases the feeling of vulnerability in the North, that they need to achieve even more sophisticated missile technology to be able to break those barriers that are being set for missile defense in Japan and South Korea and Taiwan and elsewhere. So all this means that we are in Asia, East Asia, Northeast Asia, that already you have the China-Japan tussle that's been warming up in the last 1 year. And the North Korean factor is also part of it, because the Japanese always feel that it's the Chinese are using the North to threaten Japan. So there's this whole cycle, and it's a vicious cycle. And the international community can condemn, they can impose sanctions, they can do all kinds of things. But what the North is showing is that they have the technology through a bit of pilfering, as well as through some kind of domestic, because they have this military first ideology, Songun they call it, where all the resources have been directed towards the regime and to the security establishment. So people may starve, there may be famine, but the nuclear program will go on, because the regime needs security from being toppled, and then they claim that also national security from being overrun.
So, Dr. Chaulia, so then essentially the essential problem with North Korea's nuclear program is its opacity, the fact that it is clandestine, the fact that it is under wraps, the fact that, and that lends an element of irresponsibility to it. You never know a nation which is not being transparent about its nuclear program, you never know what it's going to do about it.
Plus also the rhetoric, the political rhetoric that comes out of the country is still couched in an old Maoist terminology where, we're going to reduce our enemies into balls of fire, and we're going to destroy this. And so there is a I would say, a violence behind the language.
Do you find that rhetoric in the latest statement also?
Usually they always, whenever they describe the South or Japan or all the Western allies, it is with a kind of a certain vituperative quality to it. And just as the Israelis say, you know, why are we worried about the Iranian bomb? It's because they deny the Holocaust ever happened. It's because they say they're going to destroy Israel. And the same kind of rhetoric, they have not adapted, I would say diplomatically too. I think it's a very liberal discourse, the language that we use. Even when we threaten, there is a certain way of communicating. The North is not very good at PR. And what they've done over time is, you know, they keep saying, you know, they have these names for everybody, which sound rather silly, like they're taken out of a horror film. But what they mean by that is to send a message to their own people domestically, that we are strong, we are defiant, even though we are poor. And secondly, not to take them for granted. Part of the problem is they have this blackmail, what many people say is a blackmail strategy. Now the new South Korean president-elect is about to take over. And just at this transition, what they're saying is, you know, if we conduct the test, they're going to take us more seriously. They will not dismiss us. Because in the past, the kiloton yields of their previous, you know, Los Alamos and Lawrence Livermore, there are two laboratories in the US with contesting claims as to really whether they have achieved anything. The latest one they're saying is not even equivalent to what the Americans did in 1945 in terms of kiloton yield. So North Korea is this, you can call it an uppity or a wannabe kind of power in Asia that wants to be heard, is usually ignored, and therefore both for negotiations, for bargaining, and sometimes as a form of blackmail, because usually what happens, there are cycles. Whenever they conduct missile tests and nuclear tests, afterwards you find that there's some kind of thaw that comes in after a few months when they get humanitarian aid from the South and promises of a, you know, a long-term solution. And then again it goes back. So what they do, I think they test the waters, and the new leadership is trying to say that, you know, by being tough, we will get concessions, rather than actually the obverse which the international community wants. So we are caught in this spiral, and that's what leads to this distrust.
Okay. Dr. Chaulia, the events of recent world history, some of which have already entered history books, some of which are being written even as we talk. Iraq has already entered history books, while Libya and Syria are things are changing rapidly even as we speak. What is the relationship between, as the ambassador mentioned, North Korea is probably looking at these episodes and what their nuclear program, the kind of impact that program had on their future, and so that sort of history is not repeated in the Korean peninsula. What is this relationship that North Korea is looking at?
Well, it's what they would see as impunity. The Western coalitions of the willings being formed to overthrow many authoritarian regimes around the world, and the threat that because, as you know, since Kosovo, even before the Iraq War, United States has been frequently sidestepping the UN system and the Security Council mandates and just going ahead and toppling regimes. And the fall of Gaddafi, I mean, if you remember, Gaddafi had, in return for some economic incentives and normalization of relations with the West, given up his nuclear program. So obviously he would have rued it in his last days, because regimes, it's, you know, classically we academics also, I think we did not understand the link between regime security and possession of nuclear weapons. We used to only talk about regional balances and how, you know, one side has it and the other side doesn't, and therefore, but it's much more than that, because in single party or hereditary communist, so-called communist dictatorships like North Korea, it's about survival. And I think, one, they have the backing of China. I mean, there's no way anybody can do a humanitarian intervention or a military intervention in North Korea, even if it doesn't have nuclear weapons, because the Chinese are not going to allow that. I mean, and no one's going to, has the gall right now to confront the Chinese openly militarily in their backyard. Even if you go back to the Korean War and all that, it was a proxy Sino-American conflict. So what I always say is that the way you can resolve the Korean problem is, one, obviously reunification, but on whose terms? The Chinese want it on the terms where it will not bring American forces closer to the Chinese border. So they need North Korea as a buffer. And on the other side, the Americans want reunification in a way that the entire Korea, North and South combined, will be in the Western sphere of influence and will form this larger grouping that they are creating there to contain China. So the one way, a grand bargain between the United States and China is the only way we can reunify Korea and overcome these insecurity spirals. But for that to happen, obviously the regimes, remember these are not just client regimes, both in South and North Korea, there are these Korean nationalists who believe that they should reunify the whole peninsula on their terms. Going all the way back to the grandfather of the current North Korean dictator and Syngman Rhee on the southern side. They, in many ways, the tail was wagging the dog. During those wars, they were bringing the principles from outside. Be it the Chinese, Mao was brought in by Kim Il-sung and the Americans by Syngman Rhee. What they were saying is, we have a will to reunify the Korean peninsula on our basis, on our ideological terms. So that remains. So while there are outside players having huge impact, it also requires two to tango. There will need the groundswell of the people. People want a unification of Korea. There's no cultural division. There's so many families that have been disunited who can't even see each other for the last 40 to 50 years. It's unlike the Indian subcontinent. It's unlike some other partitions. It's closer to the German partition. This was because of occupation politics, right? So it was not because there was some kind of ideological difference or ethnic identity that was separating them. So like the Germans reunified at the drop of a hat in 1989, if the conditions are conducive, if the global powers agree, and if there's some kind of move towards reunification, I think we'll resolve this problem once and for all. Okay. But before that, the insecurities of the major players need to be somehow assuaged through some kind of modus vivendi. And that's what's been missing.
Okay. Dr. Chaulia, let's say that North Korea keeps on advancing on its nuclear program and it goes on acquiring more and more nuclear capabilities. Probably in the next 20 years, it might have a nuclear arsenal which the world will be concerned about, and especially the region will be a lot concerned about. But definitely the sort of economic problems that it has, the hardships that the average North Korean faces, those hardships, there cannot be a significant improvement in those hardships in the next 20 years. That will take a lot of time. Unless that happens, North Korea will continue to be dependent on China's support, the economic support, the huge, massive economic support that it gets from China. Does China really have anything much to be concerned about?
Well, I think they will be looking at the way Myanmar, or Burma as some people call it, also slipped out of the Chinese orbit in the last 2 to 3 years. I mean, Myanmar 2008-2009 was somewhat similar to what North Korea is. I mean, hermetically sealed country. Of course, the difference was it was a military dictatorship, but very similar. And the Chinese were using them for strategic purposes to project power into Southeast and to South Asia. So, similarly, North Korea, the Chinese will always be wary about at some point in time losing their absolute grip over North Korea. And although they are in favor of economic reforms, they will be wary about not allowing any kind of move towards democratization. And therefore, even though China itself has very, very advanced economic relations with South Korea, they are wary of the South Korean model moving up north. And therefore, I think they are going to continue to support this regime all the way and will not allow it to collapse. Okay. That's for sure. But the real bigger question is what's happening within the society. Because even in the case of Burma, there was so much ferment going on within the society, and it was too late until we realized suddenly that now, the structures have started transforming, although it is still military dominated. So that kind of evolution you can never rule out. And the new Kim, the young man as the South Koreans call him, he is relatively inexperienced. He is supposed to be under the tutelage of two regents, his uncle and all these people, and they belong to the old school. And whether they can sustain this kind of perennially, aid-dependent and frequently famine-oriented society with expensive nuclear investments remains to be seen. Okay. So I would not venture 10, 20 years down the line. Although, the other converses people were saying that this regime may collapse any moment. That's obviously not the case. It's imminent. They have survived a number of transitions from the grandfather Kim to the grandson. But you cannot be sure that the latest grandson is just barely 28, 29. So you will need to see, if fissures open up within the elite structures, between the military and the party or within these, you cannot be sure about internal coup d'etats and what can happen. So, and I only hope that Western intelligence agencies are not fueling these to the point that it will lead to instant collapse and destabilization. That's what the Chinese nightmare is. So as far as the Chinese go, I think they will do everything. I think as soon as the new Kim took over, they had sent a high-level delegation, and they've already been, and I'm sure sooner or later, Kim Jong-un will take that famous train ride into China like his fathers and grandfathers and meet with the Chinese leadership and will continue to do this. So on the one hand, the Chinese condemn these actions. They are, you can say, they're progressively embarrassed with what North Korea is doing.
Okay.
But at the same time, it's a problem child that they cannot let go, because if they let go, then their entire strategic projection, power projection, will just go awry. And for the Chinese, it's not about, I mean, the Chinese are experienced with their own history for letting millions starve in order to achieve strategic goals. So they are not looking at it from an ideological sense. North Korea may be problematic, but at the end of the day, you know, we need them and we need to keep them in our fold. But given the example of Myanmar, I think the Chinese will be dreading some kind of movement or churning within North Korean society that may go against their interests.
Okay. Dr. Chaulia, very quickly, your take. Do we have a limited role?
When Nehru was in power, he brokered armistices around the world, including the Korean War. I always believe we must be much more global and less parochial, and I think the time is coming for us to play a big role in that peninsula. Okay, time is coming for us to play a big role in a lot of other international theatres. We are probably asserting at some places, but we are not asserting ourselves at a lot of other places. Let's see when the time comes. That's all I have time for today in this discussion. Dr. Chaulia, thank you so much for your time.